Aelfric had always been a quiet man, a blacksmith by trade, living on the outskirts of a small Norse village nestled deep in the mountains. His hands, hardened by years of crafting iron, told the story of a man accustomed to shaping the world with strength and fire. But in the dark hours of the night, when the hammer was set aside, he was no longer the master of his fate. His mind was bent and twisted by something far older, far more sinister, a mare, a demon of nightmares. It began one cold winter's night when Aelfric first saw the old woman standing by the hearth. She was gaunt, her eyes hollow and lips cracked, yet she moved with unnatural grace. At first he thought she was a wanderer seeking warmth and food, but when he reached out to speak, she vanished into thin air, leaving only the scent of damp earth and decay in her wake. That night his dreams shifted. He found himself wandering through endless forests, the trees gnarled and hunched like old crones, their branches clawing at the sky. No matter how far he walked, he could not escape the feeling of being watched. In the distance he would hear the hooves of a horse, yet there was no rider in sight. It was only a shadow, flickering at the edge of his vision. For several nights, the dreams grew darker. He would awake gasping, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest as if trying to escape the confines of his ribcage. But each time, sleep would eventually claim him again, dragging him into the abyss. In one nightmare, Aelfric found himself shackled to a stone altar. Above him, a pale moon glared down, casting a sickly light over the scene. Figures shrouded in shadow surrounded him, their whispers thick with malice. And there, sitting on his chest, was the old woman. She smiled, her teeth black and rotting, as her bony fingers pressed down on his heart, squeezing until his breath caught in his throat. "You belong to me now," she whispered, her voice cold and brittle as the frost outside. From then on, Aelfric knew the mare had claimed him. His days became as bleak as his nights. The light seemed to dim around him. His food tasted of ash, and the village folk began to keep their distance. He would hear them whispering about his haggard appearance, his wild eyes, and the way he flinched at the faintest sound. Sleep brought no rest, only torment. One night, the dream took him further into madness. He stood at the edge of a vast black sea, the waves crashing against jagged rocks. But the water was not water, it was blood, thick and congealed. From its depths, the old woman rose, riding a monstrous steed with glowing eyes and a mane of flame. She extended her hand, beckoning him to step into the sea of blood. And as he stood frozen in terror, the ground beneath him gave way, and he plunged into the churning darkness. When he awoke, Aelfric could no longer tell the difference between dream and reality. The mare had wrapped her claws around his very soul, dragging him down night after night until his waking hours became as unbearable as the time spent asleep. He couldn't escape. He would see her in the corner of his vision, lurking in the shadows of his forge, whispering in his ear as he tried to work. His hands, once so steady, now shook uncontrollably, causing the metal to warp beneath his hammer. The villagers began to speak of his madness, their fear growing. He was cursed, they said. No one dared to approach him, not even to offer aid. His isolation was complete, save for the presence of the mare who visited him every night. Finally, after weeks of torment, Aelfric decided there was only one way to free himself. He could no longer endure the nights of terror, the constant sensation of suffocation as the mare pressed down on his chest. He no longer feared death. In fact, it had become his only hope for peace. On the eve of the full moon, he climbed to the highest peak overlooking the village. The wind howled, cold and unforgiving, but he did not care. In his hand, he held a small dagger. An old, worn blade that had been passed down through his family for generations. Its edge was dulled from years of use, but it would serve its purpose. With trembling hands, Aelfric looked out over the village one last time. The lights from the hearths below flickered like stars, distant and indifferent to his suffering. He pressed the dagger to his chest, feeling the cold metal against his skin. As he closed his eyes, he could see the mare, watching him from the shadows, her smile widening in anticipation. The blade pierced his flesh, and as the darkness closed in, Aelfric felt the weight lift from his chest. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, his breathing came easily. The mare's laughter echoed in his ears as he fell to the ground, but it no longer held any power over him. In death, Aelfric found the release he had sought. The mare would torment him no more. Yet, as his body lay still beneath the pale moonlight, the villagers whispered that the mare had not been satisfied. They claimed to have seen the old woman wandering through the village on cold nights, her eyes searching for her next victim. The mare, it seemed, was never truly done with the living.